So 2002 was a very exciting time. I was starting second grade. Lord of the Rings 2 Towers was in theaters, so was Spider-Man. And this came out. This is the iLamp or Sunflower iMac. And this is the one and only time that Apple used this iMac design, which really sucks because this was easily my favorite iMac design ever. What's up, guys? Welcome to another tech review. This is a retro look back at the iMac G4. So let's get started. Okay, so before I completely go geeking out over this computer, let's get a little bit of history. This is the consumer desktop side of Apple's foursquare strategy. Now, what was Apple's foursquare strategy? Well, the 90s weren't exactly kind to Apple, and when Steve Jobs came back, he realized that they had this fragmented and overcomplicated hardware strategy that just made no sense to anybody. There was no clear product for consumers, product for professionals, product for this, that. It was kind of just thrown everywhere. And the cheapest Mac at the time was well over $2,000, which was so high. It was way above any other competitive Wintel PC of the time. So Steve Jobs came back, cut pretty much everything, and narrowed it down to 4 squares. Those squares were one category for consumer, one category for pro, one desktop in the pro and consumer market, and one laptop in the pro and consumer market. And by doing that, you had desktop pro, desktop consumer, laptop pro, laptop consumer. Therefore, foursquare strategy. And this particular iMac falls in the consumer desktop category. So in 2002, Steve Jobs stood up on stage and replaced the iMac G3 with this Mac. Now, the iMac G3 was basically the computer that saved Apple in the 90s. But when it came to replacing products, Steve Jobs was completely okay with ditching an old design for something completely new if he knew that it was going to be the future. He even got up on stage and made fun of how a lot of people were saying they could just cut the back off the old iMac and put a flat screen in there and turn everything up vertically and make the new iMac.
There it is, the new iMac, ladies and gentlemen.
But due to the limitations of the technology at the time, you really couldn't do that because hard drives would have to spin slower, you'd have to spin the disk drive slower, and because Bluetooth and wireless for peripherals wasn't really a thing at the time, you still had to run cables back there, which meant they were hanging right down in front of the user. So the solution was this. Put the computer in a dome at the bottom of the machine and have a display floating on a pivoting hinge, and it was a stroke of genius. All the components could function the way that they would in a regular upright PC, but they were conveniently placed right in front of the user on the desk. And this design actually stuck from 2002 all the way out until mid-2004. Now keep in mind though, this is not, by today's standards, at all a fast computer. In fact, I had to go and find old iWork and iLife disks just to get something to run on this computer. And forget going online. This is definitely a collector's item, not a budget alternative to buying a modern Mac. So getting into the specs, this is rocking an 800 megahertz PowerPC G4, which was pretty impressive for the time. And this particular model has 512 megabytes of RAM, which half is user accessible, half isn't. Long story short, essentially there's a full-size DIMM card inside of the computer. You have to take the whole thing apart to get to it. But then on the bottom side, when you remove a panel, is a little SODIMM stick. You just connect that and that's user accessible. So technically you could upgrade it even higher, but I really didn't want to do that. Though you can put an entire gigabyte of memory in this thing, which is actually really impressive considering its age. The hard drive is a whopping 60 gigabytes, which is the entry upper model. It's kind of weird. Like you could pick the higher tier and it would come by default with a 60 gigabyte. Your options back in the day were 40, 60, and 80. That was it. And it's running macOS 10 Tiger, which it's kind of funny. This machine has a surprisingly modern design, but it definitely lacks any trace of modern performance. And the apps that I was running were right around the time that this computer was about to be retired, so they run, but they can definitely perform better with better hardware. This was definitely like at the end of this machine's life. So in general, they work, but they aren't fast. So yeah, like I said, the specs on this computer are not too impressive by today's standards, but for a consumer computer back in 2002, this was actually pretty good. Especially considering back in the day, Apple haters didn't really have any grounds to claim that Apple was charging more for less because an equivalent Windows Intel PC that was available back then for this same configuration would have cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,000 or higher. This computer was $1,799 when it came out, and that gave you a screen, it gave you a disk drive, the coolest disk drive ever. Fight me in the comments if you disagree. Like, look at that. It's a combo drive, so it can play DVDs, which actually was a pretty big deal at the time. The hard drive was really big, and the performance on PowerPC at the time was faster than anything that Intel was kicking out. Plus, keep in mind, $1,800 got you something that looked like this, whereas a $2,000 or more PC back in the day would have gotten you what looked like an oversized beige shoebox. And the screen was separate, so you actually had to run a bunch of cables and stuff. This literally just, boom, sit on your desk, done. Now what about the ports? This is where you can always tell how old a computer is. Just spin it around on the back and take a look at the ports. This is definitely before the time of all USB-C, one port to rule them all kind of thing. Get it? Because Lord of the Rings was out at this time. Anyway, bad jokes aside, what ports does it have? Well, going from right to left, this has a display port that's only capable of mirroring main display to another display, has 3 USB 1.1 ports good for almost nothing but connecting a mouse and keyboard. More on that later. A 56K modem, base T 10100 Ethernet, 2 FireWire 400 ports, a jack for the Harman Kardon / Apple speakers that this supported, and a standard headphone jack, and a Kensington lock if you really care about that. So essentially all the essentials for 2002, and this is a collectible, remember, not a modern machine that can be used in 2019. And those USB ports. So getting into those USB ports, they are USB 1.1. So keep in mind, back when Apple came out with this Mac, they were investing very heavily in FireWire. And the reason for that is because FireWire was fast enough to handle iPod connections, data transfers, printers, everything. And USB was just essentially a universal connection to run a mouse and a keyboard, and even then, it really couldn't do that well depending on the mouse or the keyboard. It was not so much plug and play as it was plug and pray. And one of the big contributing factors to this was the fact that USB 1.1 could only transfer at 12 megabits per second. To put that into perspective, I transferred a 100 megabyte file, and it took 5 minutes to transfer. By comparison, FireWire was 400 megabits per second, hence the name FireWire 400, which even when USB 2.0 came out and could run at 480 megabits per second, FireWire was still favored more heavily because of the fact that more accessories were out for it at that point, and it was still only 80 megabits short of what USB 2 could do. I just figured I'd talk about that because most of y'all watching this either don't remember that or didn't even know that it was a thing. Anyway, moving up, we're going to that floating display, and how is it? It's not bad, but it definitely hasn't aged well. It's a far cry from Apple's newest super color-accurate Retina displays and all that fun stuff. This is a 15-inch 1024 by 768 CCFL TFT display. And for those of you who don't know, CCFL means cold cathode fluorescent lights. That I needed to actually check on my script there because I couldn't remember what it stood for. But yeah, cold cathode fluorescent lamps, or fluorescent lights, whatever you want to call it, which is the same technology that they use in fluorescent lights, the kind of lights you find in warehouses or retail stores or my basement. And it's funny because that actually means that the longer you use the display, the more it kind of gets brighter to a certain point. It will actually warm up and brighten up the display the more you use it. It's definitely not as efficient as what you'd find in modern LED screens, but it works. And Steve Jobs even said that this design, this screen, signified the death or the end of CRT monitors in computers. And to a degree, he was right. There were still companies that pushed CRT monitors onto the public, which was fine because at the time they were still cheaper to manufacture. But once this computer came out and they showed that you can fit that kind of display into an all-in-one and sell it with a computer, other manufacturers hopped on board as quickly as they could. But while the screen brightness does work for me and the design does work for me, what doesn't work for me is that resolution. That has definitely not aged well. I mean, I'm sure that it looked great in 2002, but nowadays more people do more and more things that demand higher resolutions, like photo editing or video editing, and on that kind of display, you want to have multiple things open at once. I mean, just right here, right now, I have my preview screen, I have my audio screen, and I have my YouTube channel up, and I also have my power monitor. There are so many things running on this display that a smaller screen like that, with that low of a resolution, just couldn't do. But every time I run into issues like that when I mess around with that computer, I have to remind myself that that is coming from my modern perspective on hardware. To really get the use for this computer, you have to kind of go back to a different mindset. You have to go to a 2002 mindset. Google isn't king anymore. The iPhone doesn't even exist. And Steve Jobs isn't even the full-fledged CEO of Apple yet. I mean, like, come on. Things are totally different in this perspective. So let's look at it from that perspective for a minute. In that mindset, these computers were essentially used to load music onto an iPod, maybe type a paper for class or work. Spending hours on YouTube wasn't even a thing back then. In fact, this computer can't even do it now, by the way. And most of the time, you would open one thing, use it for a little while, finish up what you're doing, close it, put the computer to sleep, and go do something else, which for me was either going and playing a game on my PlayStation or Xbox at the time, or maybe even going outside and playing with the neighborhood kids, because keep in mind, I was only in second grade back in 2002. I didn't get a lot of computer time, and the computer time I did get, there wasn't a lot of it. I know I said I don't get a lot of it. Does that sink in? I didn't get a lot of computer time as a kid. That's why I do this now. So looking back at this iMac, we need to understand that consumer-grade computers of that day were required to do significantly less than what modern PCs are required to do today. It was made for when personal computing was significantly simpler. This Mac overall is definitely a testament to the insane creativity and innovation that Apple was pushing out back in the day, but this iMac, like most technology, has pretty much run its course and become obsolete. Most people just throw these away once that happens, but I'm keeping this around, and I'm keeping it functional, and I'm keeping it in the condition, hopefully, that it came out of the factory with. And I do that because I like to remind myself, and I like to show to others how far the industry has come. Not just Apple, but the entire computer industry has come in the past 17 years. And it's a reminder of how, back in the day, companies were willing to try anything to make computers thin, cool, and creative, especially Steve Jobs and Apple. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This was one of the more work-intensive videos that I've done. I've been filming this for almost a year and a half now, just getting footage together over various cameras, so that's probably why you've got some 1080p, some 4K, some colors look one way, some look the other way. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This has been one of the videos that I've wanted to do for a very long time. It was sort of a passion project video for me, and I'm glad I finally got it done. I'm glad that I'm getting it posted. Hope you guys enjoy it. What do you guys think? What was your first computer experience, or even a Mac experience? What do you guys remember as a child? Using this, using a PC? What did you have? And otherwise, check out the poll. I have a poll out, and it's going to be some more retro tech reviews, because that's really all I have that's, tech related that I can review right now. Hopefully I'll have some more modern stuff coming down the road. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe. Check out the links down in the description if you want. And otherwise, let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Make sure to be there, and have a good one.